I need you to understand something before I tell you this. I didn't imagine it. I didn't exaggerate it. And I didn't provoke it. Whatever watched me that night made a choice. It stayed just far enough away that I could doubt it, just close enough that I couldn't ignore it. And by morning, I realized that distance wasn't fear. It was restraint. That's the part I still don't know how to live with. Because if it had wanted me, really wanted me, there wouldn't have been anything left of that campsite but torn fabric and a story no one would believe. I keep telling myself it was just passing through. I keep telling myself I wasn't the reason it stopped. But I remember the way it stood there, just beyond the firelight, watching. And I know that's not true. It was there because of me. It just hadn't decided what to do with me yet. I went out there because I needed the quiet. That's the simple version. The version I told people anyway. Truth is, I needed distance from everything that felt too loud, too close, too demanding. Work, people, the constant pressure of being seen. The forest felt like the only place where I could disappear without anyone asking why. I picked a spot that wasn't marked, not on any of the usual camping maps. A clearing near a dried creek bed, surrounded by tall pines that blocked out most of the sky. It took me nearly an hour of walking off trail to reach it. That should have been my first warning. Not because it was dangerous, but because of how empty it felt. Not quiet. Empty. There's a difference you don't notice until you're standing in it. Quiet still has life in it. Insects, distant birds, wind brushing leaves. This place felt like all of that had been paused, like something had told the forest to hold its breath. I remember thinking it was perfect. That should tell you everything about the state I was in. I set up camp slowly, deliberately, trying to stretch the daylight. There's something grounding about routine. Tent, stakes, fire pit, gathering wood. Each step made me feel more in control, like I was building a boundary between me and whatever I was trying to escape. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, I had a small fire going and a sense of calm I hadn't felt in weeks. I even laughed at myself once, a quiet, dry laugh. Like maybe I'd overcomplicated everything, maybe all I needed was this. That thought didn't last long. The first thing that felt wrong wasn't a sound. It was the way the fire started acting. It burned unevenly, like the air around it was shifting in small, inconsistent currents. One moment steady, the next moment leaning sharply to one side, as if something large had just moved nearby. I checked the wind. Nothing. Not even a breeze strong enough to stir the branches above me. But the flames kept reacting, twitching like they were responding to something I couldn't see. I told myself it was nothing. I had to, because the alternative was admitting that something big enough to affect the air like that was moving, just beyond the edge of the light. I remember standing up and turning in a slow circle, scanning the tree line. That's when I noticed the smell. It didn't hit all at once. It crept in, subtle at first, then undeniable. Wet fur, rotting leaves, something metallic underneath it, like old blood left too long in the open air. It didn't belong to the forest. It felt imposed, like it had been carried in. I spoke out loud without realizing it, just a single word. Hello? It sounded wrong the second it left my mouth. Too small, too human. The forest didn't answer, but something shifted. I didn't hear footsteps. That's the part that still bothers me. Something that size should have made noise. Branches snapping, leaves crunching, something. But whatever it was moved in a way that avoided all of that. The only sign was the fire again, pulling sharply toward the trees behind me. I turned too fast. My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled, catching myself just before hitting the ground. And in that moment, that brief loss of balance, I felt it. Not physically, not a touch, a presence, close, closer than it had been before. I straightened slowly, forcing myself not to panic, because panic would have meant running, and running out there, in the dark, with something I couldn't even see properly. That would have been a mistake I wouldn't survive. I didn't see it clearly that first time, just a shape, tall, wrong in its proportions. It stood between two trees, far enough that the firelight didn't reach it fully, but close enough that I could tell it wasn't part of the landscape. It didn't move. It didn't need to. The stillness was worse. If it had charged, if it had made a sound, I could have reacted, done something. But it just stood there, watching. I remember thinking it looked like a man at first. That was my brain trying to make sense of it. But then it shifted slightly, and the illusion broke. The shoulders were too narrow, the arms too long, hanging lower than they should. The head wasn't right. Elongated, angled forward in a way that made it look like it was always leaning in, always closing distance, even when it wasn't moving. I didn't speak again. I didn't move closer. I just stood there, staring back, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, that if I blinked, if I looked away and back again, it would be gone. It wasn't. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. Time stretched in a way that made it hard to measure. Eventually, I took a step back, not toward the trees, toward the tent. The movement was small, controlled, the kind of movement you make when you don't want to trigger something. It reacted, not by coming closer, by adjusting, shifting its weight, angling its body just enough to keep me in front of it, like it was tracking me. That's when the fear settled in properly, not the sharp kind that makes you jump, the heavy kind, the kind that sinks into your chest and stays there. Because it meant this wasn't random, it wasn't passing through, it was aware of me, of my movements, of my presence. I reached the tent and crouched down slowly, pretending to adjust something near the entrance. My hands were shaking. I tried to hide it, even though there was no reason to. It already knew I was afraid. I could feel that much. The air between us felt charged, like something was building, waiting. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on before I could second-guess myself. The beam cut through the darkness, landing exactly where it had been standing. For a second, I thought it was gone. Then the light shifted slightly, and it was there again. Clearer this time. The eyes were the first thing that locked in, reflective. Not glowing, not in the way people describe in stories. Just catching the light in a way that made them stand out too much, too focused, too aware. The muzzle, because that's what it was. There was no denying it at that point. Tilted slightly, like it was studying the light, not bothered by it. Curious. That's what broke me a little. Not aggression, curiosity. Like I was the unfamiliar thing in its space. I lowered the flashlight slowly. I don't know why. Instinct, maybe. Some part of me understood that shining a light directly at it wasn't a challenge it cared about. It wasn't a deterrent. It just gave it a better look at me. The moment the beam dropped, it stepped forward. Just one step. But it was enough to bring it closer to the firelight. Enough for me to see the way its body moved. Not like an animal. Not entirely. There was a control to it. A deliberate pacing that felt measured, like it understood how it looked and chose how much to reveal. I stumbled back into the tent without thinking and zipped it shut in one quick motion. Thin fabric. That's all that separated me from it now. I knew that. It knew that. I could still see its silhouette through the material, distorted by the firelight. It didn't come closer. It didn't touch the tent. It just stood there, just beyond the reach of the flames, exactly where it had been before, watching. I stayed like that for hours, sitting inside, barely breathing, listening for any change. It didn't circle. It didn't test the perimeter. It didn't make a sound. Every so often the fire would shift, and its outline would flicker across the tent wall, reminding me it hadn't left. I tried to rationalize it, told myself it was an animal, something injured, something curious. But animals don't hold position like that. They don't watch for hours without acting. They don't maintain distance with that kind of precision. At some point I realized something worse. It wasn't waiting for an opportunity. It already had one. If it wanted to come closer, nothing was stopping it. No barrier, no real threat. The fire wasn't enough. I could feel that. It wasn't afraid of the fire. It respected it, maybe. A boundary, not a danger. That's when the thought hit me, and I wish it hadn't. It wasn't staying back because it couldn't come closer. It was staying back because it chose to. The night stretched on like that, each minute heavier than the last. I must have drifted in and out of something like sleep, because I remember moments disappearing, snapping back with a jolt when the fire cracked or shifted. Every time I looked at the tent wall, it was still there, unmoving, unwavering, just watching. Toward the early hours, something changed. The smell grew stronger, sharper, and there was a sound, not a step, not a growl, breathing, slow, deep, close enough that I could hear the subtle rasp of it, like air passing through something not entirely clean. I froze. The silhouette hadn't moved, but the sound was closer than it should have been. For a second, I thought there were two of them. That idea hit hard and fast, sending a spike of panic through me, so intense I almost tore the tent open just to see. I didn't. I stayed still. Because the breathing stopped. Just like that. And in the silence that followed, I realized something even worse. It hadn't been closer. I had just noticed it properly for the first time. It had been that close the entire time. Morning came slowly. The kind of gray light that seeps in before the sun actually rises. I watched the tent wall as the shadows shifted, waiting for it to disappear. It didn't fade the way normal things do when light returns. It stayed solid until the light was strong enough that it should have revealed everything. And then, it wasn't there anymore. No movement, no retreat, just gone. I didn't leave the tent right away. I waited, counted seconds, then minutes, listening. The forest sound came back first. Birds, insects, the wind moving through the trees like it had permission again. Only then did I unzip the tent and step out. The fire was almost dead, reduced to embers. The clearing looked exactly the same, except for one thing. The ground at the edge of the light, where it had been standing. The earth was disturbed, not torn up, not clawed, just pressed. Deep impressions, spaced in a way that didn't match any animal I knew. Too long, too narrow, and there were no tracks leading away from them. That's the part that stayed with me the most. It had stood there for hours, long enough to leave marks in the ground, and when it left, it didn't walk away. It just stopped being there. I packed up faster than I ever have in my life. No hesitation, no second thoughts. I didn't look back as I left the clearing. I didn't stop until I hit the trail again, until there were signs of other people, other movement, something normal. I told myself it was over, that I'd made it out, that whatever it was had decided I wasn't worth the effort, but that thought doesn't hold up anymore. Because of something I noticed later, something I didn't see at the time. When I got home, I found dirt on the back of my jacket, not mud from the trail. Darker, finer, the kind of soil from that clearing. And I don't remember ever turning my back to it, not once. Which means at some point, when I wasn't looking, When I thought I knew exactly where it was, it had moved, closer than I ever realized, close enough to reach out, close enough to touch me. And still, it didn't. That's the part I can't explain. It watched me all night. It could have ended it at any moment, but it didn't. It just stayed there, holding that distance, like it was deciding something. And whatever conclusion it reached, I'm still here because of it. I didn't go back to the forest after that, not right away. I told myself I needed time to process it, to come up with a version of the story that made sense before I even thought about setting foot out there again. But the truth is simpler than that. I was afraid that if I went back too soon, I wouldn't be coming back at all. Fear like that doesn't leave cleanly. It lingers in small ways, in how you check the corners of a room before turning your back, in how silence stops feeling peaceful and starts feeling loaded, like something is choosing not to make noise. For a few days, I convinced myself it was over, that whatever happened out there stayed out there. But then the details started to shift. Not the memory itself, the meaning of it. That's what changed. At first, I focused on what it didn't do. It didn't attack. It didn't chase. It didn't cross that invisible line the fire had drawn. That felt like a win, in a way I didn't question too deeply. But the more I replayed it, the more that line started to feel less like protection and more like permission. Like it had chosen to respect it, not because it had to, but because it wanted to see what I would do inside it. That thought didn't come all at once. It built slowly, like everything else about that night. Small inconsistencies stacking up until they stopped being ignorable. The way it adjusted when I moved. The way it stepped forward only after I lowered the flashlight. The way it stayed just outside the light, never fully revealing itself unless I forced the issue. That wasn't random behavior. That was controlled, deliberate. And the worst part is, it worked. It kept me exactly where it wanted me, contained, predictable, observable. I started noticing other things, too. Things I hadn't paid attention to in the moment because fear had narrowed my focus. Like the smell. It hadn't just been in the air, it had clung to me. My clothes, my skin. I showered twice the day I got back, scrubbed harder than I needed to, but every now and then I'd catch it again. Faint, almost imagined, but it was there, especially at night. Always at night. The first time I heard it again, I almost convinced myself it was part of a dream. I woke up suddenly, no clear reason why, just that instinctive jolt, like something had changed in the room. My apartment was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that feels intentional. I lay there for a minute, staring at the ceiling, waiting for my breathing to slow down. And then I heard it. Soft, rhythmic, breathing. Not mine. That's what I told myself at first, anyway, that it was just my own breathing, distorted by the way the room carried sound in the dark. But I held my breath to check, and it didn't stop. It stayed steady, measured, coming from somewhere near the window. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body locked up in a way I hadn't felt since the tent. That same heavy fear settling in, pressing down, making even the smallest movement feel like a risk I couldn't afford. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds, maybe less. Then it stopped. No footsteps, no shift, just silence again. I stayed awake until morning. When the light finally came in, I checked the window. Nothing. No marks, no signs that anything had been there. Just my reflection staring back at me, looking worse than I expected. Tired, drawn, like I hadn't really left that clearing at all. I told myself it was stress, that my mind was replaying the experience, turning it into something bigger than it was. That's what people do when something doesn't fit neatly into reality. They reshape it until it does. I tried to move on, went back to work, started seeing people again, keeping conversations surface level so I wouldn't have to explain why I kept drifting off mid-sentence, why I kept glancing at windows, at reflections, at anything that might show me something standing just outside my line of sight. It didn't take long before the cracks started showing. Little things, at first. Objects slightly out of place. My jacket, the one I'd worn that night, left hanging by the door. And sometimes I'd find it on the chair instead. Not thrown there. Placed, like someone had moved it carefully. I live alone. There's no one else who could have done that. I checked the locks more than once. Everything was secure. No signs of forced entry, no reason to believe anyone had been inside. But the feeling didn't go away. That sense of being observed. Not constantly, not enough to prove anything. Just in brief moments, like something was checking in, making sure I was still where it expected me to be. The second time I heard the breathing, I was fully awake. Sitting on the couch, TV on low volume, trying to drown out the silence with something normal. It started subtly, blending in with the ambient noise until I noticed the pattern. Slower than mine. Deeper. Controlled. I muted the TV without thinking. The sound became clearer immediately. Behind me, from the hallway leading to the bedroom. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The memory of that clearing, of that still shape watching me from just beyond the light, locked me in place, because I knew what would happen if I looked. It wouldn't be gone. It would be there. Close enough this time that there wouldn't be any doubt. The breathing stopped after a few seconds, same as before. No movement, no follow-up, just silence. I sat there for a long time after that, trying to decide what scared me more. The idea that something was actually there, or the possibility that it wasn't, and my mind was breaking under the weight of what I'd seen. Either way, the result was the same. I wasn't safe. Not in the way I used to be, not in the way I could ignore. I started sleeping with the lights on, not because I thought it would stop anything, but because the darkness had become too much like that night. Too full of things just out of sight. I moved the jacket into a closet, closed the door, told myself it would help. It didn't. The smell still came back sometimes, faint, lingering, like it had seeped into more than just fabric, like it had followed me in a way I couldn't wash off. I thought about going back, more than once, not because I wanted to, but because part of me needed to know if it was still there, if the clearing would feel the same, if the ground would still hold those impressions, or if it had all been a single moment, isolated, unrepeatable. But every time I got close to making that decision, something stopped me. Not fear, not exactly. It felt more like awareness, like some part of me understood that going back wouldn't give me answers. It would just put me back in its space, on its terms, and I wasn't sure I'd get the same outcome twice. The realization that finally settled in, the one I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried, was this. It hadn't been watching the campsite. Not really. It had been watching me. The campsite was just where I happened to be. That's why it stayed at the edge of the light. That's why it matched my movements, reacted to my actions. It wasn't guarding territory. It was observing behavior, learning. And when I left, it didn't lose interest. It just changed distance. That's what the breathing means. That's what the small changes, the misplaced objects, the lingering smell all point to. It didn't follow me in the way something physical would, not step for step, not trackable, not visible. It just remained aware. Present in a way I can't measure. I don't see it, not clearly, not the way I did that night. But sometimes, when the room gets too quiet, when the air feels just slightly off, like it did around the fire, I know it's there. Not close enough to touch, Not anymore. But not far, either. And the worst part, the part I haven't told anyone until now, is that I don't think it's trying to scare me. Fear was just the first step. What it's doing now feels different, more patient, like it's waiting for something. Not an opportunity, a change, in me. I don't know what that means yet. I don't know what it wants, or if want is even the right word for something like that. But I know this much. That night in the forest wasn't an encounter. It was an introduction, and whatever decision it was making while it stood there, just beyond the firelight, it hasn't finished making it. I tried to measure it after that, not in any scientific way, just patterns, times, gaps, anything that would make it feel less like something choosing and more like something following rules. Because rules can be understood. Rules can be broken. What I was dealing with didn't feel like it had either. It felt selective. The breathing didn't happen every night. That would have been easier in a strange way, predictable. Instead, it came in irregular intervals, sometimes 2 nights in a row, sometimes nothing for days, long enough that I'd start to believe it was fading, that whatever connection had formed out there was weakening with distance and time. And then it would come back. Same pattern, same depth, same impossible stillness afterward, like it knew exactly how long to stay before disappearing again. I started leaving things out on purpose, small objects, a glass on the counter positioned a certain way, a chair slightly angled off-center, not obvious enough to draw attention if someone else walked in, but specific enough that I'd notice if they moved. Most of the time, nothing changed. That almost made it worse, because it meant either I was wrong or it was choosing not to engage with the test. The first time something did move, I didn't notice it right away. That's how subtle it was. A pen I'd left near the edge of the table, parallel to the grain of the wood. When I came back into the room later, it was rotated, just slightly, a few degrees off. Not fallen, not knocked, turned. I stood there for a long time staring at it, trying to reconstruct some version of events where I'd done it without realizing. A distracted movement, a careless brush of my hand. But the angle was too precise. It didn't feel accidental. It felt corrected, like something had adjusted it for a reason I couldn't see. I didn't touch it after that. I left it there for the rest of the day, checking it every time I passed through the room. It didn't move again. That wasn't the point. The point was that it had moved at all, that something had interacted with my space in a way that left no trace except intention. That's when I made the mistake I keep coming back to. The one decision I can't undo, no matter how many times I replay it. I acknowledged it. Not out loud, not in any direct way. But I stopped pretending it wasn't happening. I stopped dismissing the details as stress or imagination. I accepted fully that something was there, watching, interacting, choosing when to be noticed and when not to be. And the moment I did that, things changed. It didn't escalate immediately. That would have been too obvious, too easy to identify as cause and effect. Instead, it became more consistent. The gaps between events shortened. The breathing came more often. The smell lingered longer when it appeared, less faint, more defined. And the movements, small as they were, started to feel less like isolated incidents and more like responses. I tested that too, carefully. I'd move something deliberately, then leave the room, come back later and find it untouched, or sometimes adjust it again, but not back to where it started. Just different, like a continuation of whatever logic it was applying. I started thinking about that night in the forest differently, about the way it had mirrored me, tracked my movements, held its position at the edge of the firelight. It hadn't been random then. Why would it be random now? The idea that settled in, the one I couldn't shake, was that it was still observing patterns, still learning. Only now, the environment had changed. The variables were different, and I was the only constant. Sleep became complicated, not impossible, just fractured. I drift off for an hour, maybe two, then wake up suddenly with that same feeling from the first night, like something had shifted just enough to matter. Sometimes there'd be nothing, no sound, no smell, no indication that anything had happened at all. Those nights were almost worse, because they left me questioning whether the absence was real or just another choice. The third time I heard it from the hallway, I did something I hadn't done before. I spoke. It wasn't planned. It just happened. Quiet. Controlled. "I know you're there." The words felt heavy in the room, like they didn't belong. The breathing didn't stop immediately this time. It continued for a few seconds after I spoke, steady as ever. And then it changed. Not louder, not closer, just different. There was a shift in the rhythm, subtle but unmistakable, like it had registered the sound, processed it, and adjusted in response. I felt my throat tighten, because that was new. That was interaction, not just observation. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. The silence that followed felt attentive, focused in a way it hadn't before, like I'd crossed some kind of line without understanding what was on the other side of it. After that, the apartment didn't feel like mine anymore. Not entirely. It felt shared. Not in a physical sense. There was still no visible presence, no shape in the doorway, no reflection that didn't match what should have been there. But the awareness was constant now. Even in the middle of the day, even with noise, with distractions, with other people around. It didn't matter. There were moments, brief, easy to miss, where the air would shift slightly, the same way it had around the fire. A subtle pressure change, a barely perceptible distortion that made everything feel just a little off. No one else noticed. Of course they didn't. Why would they? Whatever this was, it wasn't for them. It had never been for them. It had been for me from the beginning. That thought should have pushed me to leave, to get out of the apartment, to change locations, to put as much distance between me and that clearing as possible. But distance didn't mean the same thing anymore, not after what I'd experienced. It had already proven that. So I stayed, not because I felt safe, but because I needed to understand, needed to see where it would go, what it would do next. That's the part I'm not proud of, the part that feels like a choice I made, not something that happened to me. Curiosity can look a lot like courage from the outside. It's not. It's something else, something closer to surrender. The next shift wasn't in the apartment. It was in me. Small at first, easy to ignore. I started noticing things before they happened, not clearly, not in a way I could act on, just impressions, like knowing which room would feel wrong before I entered it, knowing when the silence was about to deepen, when the air was about to change. It wasn't constant. It came in flashes, but each time it happened, it left me a little less certain of where the boundary was, between what I was sensing and what it was showing me. I tested that too, because by then, testing had become a habit I couldn't break. I'd stand in the doorway of the hallway, waiting, not moving, not speaking, just listening. And sometimes, before the breathing started, I'd feel it. That same presence I'd felt when I stumbled near the fire. Close, watching. And then, a second later, the sound would follow. Like confirmation. Like it was letting me know I'd been right. That I was starting to understand. That's when the fear shifted again. It wasn't about what it might do to me physically. That fear had been there from the beginning. but it had never been acted on. Not really. This was different. This was about what it was doing to me mentally, to the way I perceived things, the way I anticipated them, because the more I aligned with it, intentionally or not, the less distance there was between us. Not in space, in perception. And that's when the memory of the clearing came back, sharper than before. Not the image of it standing there, the feeling. The moment I realized it wasn't crossing the firelight because it didn't need to, because the boundary wasn't for it, it was for me. That same pattern was repeating now, only there was no fire, no visible line to define where I ended and it began. Just a gradual shift, subtle enough that I couldn't point to a single moment and say that's when it happened. That's when things changed. The realization didn't come all at once. It built, like everything else, piece by piece, until it formed something I couldn't ignore anymore. It wasn't trying to get closer, not physically. It was trying to bring me to the same place it existed, to narrow the gap until there was no difference between what I experienced and what it was. I don't know how else to explain it. I just know what it felt like. Like the world I understood was being adjusted, slowly, carefully, until it matched something else. Something older. Something that didn't follow the same rules I was used to. I started catching myself mid-thought, unsure if an idea was mine or something that had been placed there. Not forced, suggested. Like the pen on the table, turned just slightly, just enough to change its orientation without drawing immediate attention. That's how it felt inside my own head. Subtle, precise, intentional. And the worst part is, it was working. Not all at once, not enough to take anything away from me completely, but enough to make me question where I ended, enough to make me hesitate before dismissing something as impossible, because impossible didn't mean the same thing anymore. Not after that night. Not after everything that followed. I started thinking about going back again. Not out of curiosity this time. Not entirely. There was something else underneath it. A pull. Faint, but steady. Like a direction I was being guided toward, without any explicit instruction. The clearing. The place where it had started. Where it had first chosen to stay just outside the light and watch. The idea settled in slowly, the same way all of this had. And once it was there, it didn't leave. It just waited, like everything else, like it. Waiting for me to decide, or maybe just waiting for me to realize that the decision had already been made. I held off longer than I should have, not because I didn't feel it pulling me back, but because I understood, at least on some level, that going back would change things in a way I wouldn't be able to undo. There's a difference between something reaching into your world and you stepping into its. Up until that point, everything that had happened, every sound, every shift, every quiet adjustment, had still been on my side of that line, my space, my rules, even if they weren't holding the way they used to. Going back meant giving that up. It meant meeting it where it had first decided to notice me. And once that happened, I wasn't sure there'd be a way to step back again. But the pull didn't stop. It didn't get stronger, not in any obvious way. It didn't need to. It was consistent, present in the background of everything I did, like a thought I hadn't finished thinking yet. I'd catch myself drifting, losing track of conversations, of time, of simple tasks, because part of me was already somewhere else, somewhere quiet, somewhere empty in that specific way the clearing had been. It got to the point where staying felt just as wrong as going, like I was delaying something inevitable, rather than avoiding it. That's how it justified itself in my head, not as a choice, but as something already in motion. So I went back. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't leave a note or make a plan. That felt unnecessary, almost irrelevant. Whatever this was, it had never involved anyone else. It had always been contained between me and it. I packed lighter this time. No extra gear, no distractions, just the basics. Tent, water, flashlight, the same things I'd brought the first time, stripped down to what I actually needed, or what I thought I needed. The walk felt shorter. I don't know if it actually was, or if I just didn't notice the time the same way. The forest changed as I got closer, just like before. The sounds thinned out, the air grew still. That same unnatural emptiness settled in, pressing down, familiar in a way that made something in my chest tighten. Not fear, not exactly. Recognition. I knew where I was before I saw it. The clearing opened up ahead of me, exactly as I remembered. Same trees, same dry creek bed, same open space that felt too still to be natural. But something was different, subtle, hard to pin down at first. It took me a moment to realize what it was. There were no marks on the ground. The impressions it had left that first night, those deep, narrow shapes pressed into the earth, were gone. Not faded, not worn down by time or weather. Gone. Like they'd never been there at all. That should have been a relief. Proof that something had reset. That whatever happened before had been contained to that one moment. But it didn't feel like that. It felt cleaned, like a surface wiped down before something new begins. I stepped into the clearing slowly, my eyes scanning the tree line without meaning to, half expecting to see it there already, standing in the same place, just beyond where the firelight would reach. But there was nothing, just trees. Still, watching in their own way, but not like it had. I set up camp the same way I had before. Same spot, or as close as I could remember. Same routine. Tent, stakes, fire pit. My hands moved without hesitation, like they'd done it 100 times. That part felt wrong. Too smooth, too automatic. Like I wasn't building something new, just repeating something that had already happened. The fire caught quickly. The flames rose steady, controlled, unaffected by any movement in the air. I watched them longer than I needed to, waiting for that first sign, that shift, that subtle pull to one side that would tell me I wasn't alone. It didn't come. Not right away. The sun dipped behind the trees, shadows stretching out across the clearing, until the only real light came from the fire. I sat there, just outside the tent, listening. The silence settled in, heavier than before. Not empty this time. Expectant. That's the only way I can describe it. Like something was about to happen, and the forest knew it. I spoke again. I don't know why. Maybe because I'd already crossed that line back in the apartment. Maybe because staying silent felt like pretending this was still just a normal night. I came back. The words felt small, swallowed by the space around me. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the fire shifted. Not sharply, not like before. Just a slight lean, a subtle reaction that might have gone unnoticed if I hadn't been watching for it. My chest tightened. There it was, the first sign. The air had changed. I stood up slowly, turning toward the direction the flames had leaned. The trees looked the same, dark, indistinct shapes blending into each other. But the feeling was there, that presence, not distant, not as far as it had been the first time, closer. I didn't reach for the flashlight, not yet. I just stood there, letting my eyes adjust, letting that awareness settle in. And then I saw it. Not all at once. The outline came first. A distortion in the darkness, something that didn't match the lines of the trees behind it. Then the shape resolved, slowly, like my mind was catching up to what was already there. It stood at the edge of the clearing, not between the same two trees as before. Closer. just outside the reach of the firelight, but not by much. Close enough that I could make out more detail without forcing it. It hadn't been that close the first time, I'm sure of that. The proportions were the same. Too tall, too narrow through the shoulders, arms hanging longer than they should, ending in shapes I didn't want to focus on too closely. The head angled forward, that elongated silhouette that refused to fit into anything familiar. But the stillness was different. It didn't feel like it was holding position anymore. It felt like it was waiting for me. I didn't step back. That's the part that scares me now, looking back on it. The first time, every instinct I had told me to create distance, to get behind something, to put a barrier between me and it. This time, I stayed where I was. I met it at that invisible line without even thinking about it. The firelight flickered between us, a thin boundary that suddenly felt a lot less significant than it had before. "You followed me," I said. The words came out steadier than I felt. No answer. Of course there wasn't. But something changed. Not in its position, in the air. That same pressure shift, subtle but undeniable, like the space between us had tightened. I took a step forward, just one. The movement felt deliberate, like I was testing something I already knew the answer to. It reacted immediately, not by retreating, by matching me. One step forward, keeping the distance exactly the same. That was the moment everything clicked into place. It had never been about the fire, never about the campsite. The distance between us had always been controlled, maintained, measured. I took another step. It did the same, always keeping that same gap. Close enough that I could see it clearly now. The texture of its body, not fur the way you'd expect, not clean, not uniform. Something rougher, uneven. The way the light caught on it in patches that didn't reflect the way animal fur should. And the eyes. They weren't reflecting the fire the way they had with the flashlight. They were just there, fixed on me. Not curious anymore, not distant, focused, aware in a way that felt heavier than before. Like it wasn't studying me anymore. It already knew what it needed to know. I stopped moving. So did it. The distance held, unbroken. I realized then that I could keep stepping forward forever, and it would keep adjusting. The gap would never close unless it chose to let it. That thought settled in deep, heavier than anything I'd felt the first night. Because it meant control. Complete control over how close this got, how far it stayed, how much it revealed. And I wasn't the one setting any of those terms. The fire cracked behind me, louder than it should have been. I flinched slightly, just enough to break the stillness. In that moment, just that brief distraction, it moved. Not forward, not back, sideways. Fast enough that I didn't track the motion, just the result. It was no longer directly in front of me. It was off to the side, at an angle that put the fire between us. My heart slammed against my chest, because that hadn't been a reaction, that had been repositioning. Like it was adjusting the scene, changing the perspective. I turned slowly to face it again, trying to keep it in front of me. It didn't move this time. It didn't need to. The new angle held. And in that position, with the firelight cutting across it differently, I saw something I hadn't before. Its posture. The way it leaned forward, just slightly. Not enough to suggest movement, but enough to suggest intent. Like a question that hadn't been asked out loud. I felt something shift inside me then. Not fear. Not exactly. Something closer to understanding. The kind that doesn't come with words. Just a realization that settles in whether you want it to or not. The distance wasn't a boundary. It was a condition, a rule. And rules can change. The thought came with a weight that made it hard to breathe. Because if that rule changed, if it decided to close that gap, there wouldn't be anything left to negotiate. I didn't move again. I didn't speak. I just stood there, feeling that invisible line between us like it was something real, something I could almost reach out and touch. And for the first time since I'd stepped into that clearing, I got the sense that it was waiting for me to do exactly that. I don't know how long we stood like that. Time stopped behaving in any way I could track. It stretched, folded, collapsed into something that felt less like passing moments and more like pressure building in a closed space. The fire crackled behind me, steady, grounding. The only thing that still followed rules I understood. Everything else didn't. I kept my eyes on it. I had to. Looking away felt like giving something up, like losing whatever fragile awareness I'd managed to hold on to. And it watched me the same way. Unblinking, unwavering. That fixed attention that didn't feel curious anymore, didn't feel cautious. It felt certain. That's what started to settle in, slowly, heavily. This wasn't a standoff. It wasn't waiting to see what I would do. It already knew. The waiting was for something else, something in me. My hand moved before I fully decided to move it. Not fast, not hesitant either. Just a slow extension forward, fingers slightly apart, like I was reaching into something I couldn't see. The air between us felt thicker the further I reached, like pushing through water instead of empty space. My chest tightened, breath catching halfway in. Every instinct I had, every leftover piece of something that still understood fear, was telling me to stop, to pull back, to break whatever this was before it crossed a point I couldn't come back from. I didn't, because underneath that fear, there was something else. That same pull that had brought me back here, that quiet, steady certainty that this had already been decided long before I understood I was part of it. My finger stopped inches short of where that invisible line should have been, and for a second, nothing happened. No reaction, no movement. Just that same impossible stillness holding everything in place. Then it leaned. Not a step, not a shift of weight. A lean. Forward, just enough to close the distance I hadn't. And the space between us, whatever it had been, collapsed. I didn't feel a physical touch, not in the way I expected. No impact, no pressure on my skin. It was deeper than that. Immediate, total, like something passing through me instead of into me. My vision fractured for a second, the clearing splitting into overlapping layers that didn't align properly. The fire, the trees, the shape in front of me, all of it still there, but distorted, stretched, seen from angles that didn't make sense. And underneath it, something else. Another version of the same space. Not different, just perceived differently. I don't know how to explain that without it sounding like I'm losing my mind. Maybe I am. But I remember it clearly. Too clearly. The forest wasn't empty. It had never been empty. It was full of movement I hadn't been able to register before. Subtle shifts. Shapes that weren't solid, weren't fixed, moving in ways that didn't disturb the air or the ground, the way physical things should. And it, what I'd been calling it, wasn't separate from that. It was part of it, defined only because I needed it to be. My hand dropped back to my side without me telling it to. My body swayed slightly, like I'd lost my balance, but I didn't fall. The fire snapped sharply, pulling my focus back, collapsing everything into the version of the clearing I recognized. Trees, ground, light. And it, standing exactly where it had been, just beyond the edge of the firelight. The distance had reset, like nothing had happened. Except it had. I could feel it, not on my skin, inside. A shift I couldn't undo. I sucked in a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and staggered back a step. This time, it didn't follow. It didn't match me. It stayed where it was, watching. But something about that watching had changed. It wasn't measuring distance anymore. It wasn't maintaining anything. It was done. That's the only word that fits. Whatever it had been waiting for, whatever condition had needed to be met, it had happened. A cold realization settled in, heavier than anything before it. This had never been about getting closer, not physically. The distance had been a test, a structure, a way to control the interaction until the right moment, and I had just removed it. Or maybe I had just stepped into it fully. I don't know which is worse. I don't remember deciding to leave. 1 second I was standing there, trying to process what had just happened, and the next I was moving, fast. Not running blindly, but not careful either. Just putting distance between me and that clearing in the most direct way possible. The trees blurred past, branches catching at my clothes, the ground uneven under my feet. I didn't look back, not once. I couldn't. Some part of me knew that if I did, I wouldn't see it standing there anymore. And that would have been worse, much worse, because it would mean it wasn't staying behind this time. The forest didn't feel empty on the way out. It felt crowded. Not with things I could see clearly, not with shapes I could point to and define. Just a constant sense of movement at the edges of perception, like the space around me was more active than it had any right to be. I kept going until the sounds came back. Birds, wind, normal noise that felt almost too loud after what I'd just experienced. I didn't stop moving until I hit the trail. The real trail. The one other people used. Only then did I slow down, my legs shaking, breath uneven, heart still trying to catch up. I told myself I was out, that whatever had happened back there was contained to that place, that I'd crossed into something and then back out again. But that thought didn't hold, not even for a second, because the moment I stopped moving, I felt it, not behind me, not in front, not anywhere I could point to, just present. The same way it had been in the apartment, the same way it had been before I came back here. Only now, it wasn't distant. It wasn't observing from the edge of anything. It was aligned. That's the only word I can use. Aligned with me in a way that didn't depend on space anymore. I made it home without remembering most of the drive. The city felt wrong when I got back. Too structured, too defined. Everything in straight lines and fixed shapes that suddenly felt artificial. Like a simplified version of something more complex I'd just barely started to perceive. The apartment was the same as I'd left it. Nothing out of place, nothing moved. But the feeling was different. The space didn't feel shared anymore. It didn't feel observed. It felt integrated. That's when the fear finally came back. Not sharp, not immediate, slow and heavy, settling in as the realization fully formed. It wasn't outside anymore, not in the hallway, not near the window, not waiting at a distance. I sat down, hands shaking, trying to find something, anything, that still felt solid, still felt mine. My thoughts didn't line up the way they used to. There were gaps, overlaps, moments where I couldn't tell if something I was remembering had actually happened, or if it was something I'd seen in that other layer of the forest. I closed my eyes, hoping it would help, hoping it would shut everything out for a second. It didn't. The darkness wasn't empty. It never is, not really. But this time, it wasn't just the usual patterns, the random shapes your mind fills in. There was structure there. Movement that followed a logic I couldn't fully grasp, but somehow recognized. I opened my eyes again immediately, breath catching. That was new. That had never happened before. And it meant one thing I didn't want to accept. I hadn't brought something back with me. I hadn't been followed. There was no separation left for that. What happened in that clearing, it wasn't an encounter. It wasn't even an introduction anymore. It was a change. In me. In how I perceive things. In what I'm connected to. The distance it kept that first night. The distance I thought was restraint. That wasn't about safety. It was about timing. About keeping things separate until the moment they didn't need to be anymore. I don't hear the breathing in the apartment now. Not the way I used to. Not from the hallway or the window. That would almost be easier. Easier to point to. Easier to deny. Now when I notice it, it's synced with mine. Not perfectly. Not in a way that's obvious at first. Just close enough that if I focus on it too long, I can't tell which one started first. I don't see it standing at the edge of rooms anymore. I don't catch glimpses of movement where there shouldn't be any. Instead, I see more of everything else. The spaces between things. The slight distortions that were always there, but never meant anything until now. And sometimes, just for a second, I understand them. Not consciously. Not in words I can explain. Just a flash of recognition that fades as soon as I try to hold on to it. That's what it wanted. Not proximity, not pursuit, not even interaction, not in the way I thought. It wanted alignment, and I gave it exactly that. The worst part isn't what I see now, it's what I'm starting to feel. The pull hasn't gone away. It's changed. It's not drawing me back to the clearing anymore, not specifically. It's broader than that. Less about a place, more about a state. The same stillness, the same emptiness that isn't really empty. I catch myself seeking it out without realizing, turning off lights, sitting in silence longer than I should, letting the noise of everything else fade until there's nothing left but that familiar pressure in the air, that familiar sense of something just beyond definition. And each time I do, it gets easier to slip into that other way of seeing, that other layer. I don't think it's finished. I don't think this was ever meant to end with that night, or even with me coming back. This feels like the beginning of something that doesn't have a clear end point, a process, not an event. And I don't know what happens when it's complete. I don't know what I'll be left with, or what I'll become part of. I just know that the distance is gone now. Completely gone. And sometimes, when I sit there in the quiet, when I let everything else fall away, I can feel it, not as something separate, but as something waiting in the same space I occupy. Not watching anymore, not deciding, just there, like it always was, like it always will be. And the thought that keeps coming back, the one I can't shake, no matter how much I want to, is this. That night in the forest, when it stood just beyond the firelight, wasn't the moment I was in danger. It was the last moment I was entirely my own. I tried to hold on to what was left of myself after that. Not in any dramatic way. I didn't quit my job or disappear or start telling people what had happened. On the outside, everything stayed the same. That was important. Structure, routine, things that followed predictable patterns. I needed that more than I realized. Because inside, things weren't holding their shape anymore. The shifts didn't come all at once. They never did. That would have been too obvious, too easy to resist. Instead, it was gradual. Subtle changes in how I processed things, how I reacted. The first time I noticed it clearly, I was in a crowded place, grocery store, bright lights, people moving in every direction, voices overlapping in that constant low noise you stop noticing after a while. I'd always found it a little overwhelming, but manageable, normal. That day, it felt thin. Like the noise wasn't filling the space the way it should. Like there were gaps between the sounds, small pockets of silence that didn't belong there. I stood still in the middle of an aisle longer than I should have, just listening, trying to figure out what was missing. No one else reacted. No one else noticed. Of course they didn't. Whatever I was starting to perceive, it wasn't part of their version of things. It never had been. I left without buying anything. I told myself I just wasn't feeling well, that I needed air, space, something less confined. But when I stepped outside, it followed. Not as a presence, not as something behind me or near me. Just that same subtle distortion layered over everything. The world looked the same. It just didn't feel as solid. Like it was a surface I'd started to see through, instead of something I was fully inside. That should have scared me more than it did. Maybe it did, at first. But fear doesn't stay sharp when it's stretched over time. It dulls. It becomes something else, something closer to acceptance, or maybe just exhaustion. I started adapting without meaning to. That's the part that bothers me now, not the change itself, but how easy it became to adjust to it. I'd find quiet spaces without thinking, corners of rooms, empty streets late at night, anywhere the noise dropped low enough that I could feel that other layer more clearly. At first, it was uncomfortable, disorienting, but the more I did it, the more familiar it felt, like returning to something instead of stepping into it. I stopped fighting the moments when my perception shifted, stopped forcing myself to focus on what was normal, because normal didn't feel right anymore. It felt incomplete, like I was only seeing part of something that had always been there. The breathing changed, too. It's hard to explain that without it sounding impossible, but I'll try. It wasn't just that I noticed it aligning with mine. It was that sometimes it led. I'd take a breath, and it would already be there. Not ahead by enough to be obvious. Just enough that when I paid attention, I couldn't tell if I was following it instead of the other way around. I tested that, the same way I tested everything else. Holding my breath longer than I should, changing my rhythm deliberately, quick inhales, slow exhales, and each time it adjusted, not instantly, not perfectly, but close enough that it felt like a response, not a coincidence. That's when the thought came back, the one from the clearing, about alignment, about the distance never being physical, about this not being something that moves through space the way I understand it. Because if it doesn't need space, it doesn't need to cross it either. I started noticing patterns in other things, not just in myself, in the environment, the way shadows held for a fraction of a second longer than they should when I moved past them, the way reflections didn't quite match the angle they were supposed to at certain moments. Small things, easy to dismiss if you catch them once, impossible to ignore when they repeat. I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't. Not because I thought they'd think I was lying, but because I knew they wouldn't see it. And trying to explain something like that to someone who can't perceive it doesn't clarify it. It breaks it, turns it into something smaller, something easier to dismiss. I wasn't ready for that. I'm still not. The dreams started after that. Not immediately. Like everything else, they took their time. At first, they were just fragments. The clearing, the fire, that same fixed distance between me and something I couldn't fully see. But each time, the details got sharper, more consistent, until it stopped feeling like a dream and started feeling like revisiting. The difference was in the perspective. The first few times, I was seeing it the way I remembered, standing by the fire, looking out at the edge of the light, waiting, watching. But then it shifted, slowly. The angle changed, not dramatically, just enough that I wasn't seeing the scene from where I had been. I was seeing it from the edge of the clearing, looking in, at myself. That's when I started waking up with that same heavy feeling in my chest, like something had settled deeper than it was supposed to. Because it wasn't just a different angle. It came with a different understanding. The way I stood by the fire, the way I moved, small, controlled steps, trying not to provoke something I couldn't see clearly. It looked predictable, contained, the same way I must have looked to it that first night. That realization didn't fade when I woke up. It stayed, lingering at the edges of everything else I thought about. Because it meant the perspective shift wasn't just in the dream, it was in me. I started catching myself in reflections more often, not because something was wrong with them, but because something felt too right, too aligned. Like I wasn't just looking at myself anymore. Like I was looking at a version of myself that matched something else I couldn't see directly. The first time I almost spoke to my reflection, I stepped back so fast I hit the wall behind me. Not because it moved. It didn't. It stayed exactly as it should have. But the thought had been there. Clear. Immediate. Not "this is me." Something else. Something closer to recognition. I avoided mirrors after that. Not completely. You can't. Not entirely. But I stopped looking at them longer than necessary. Stopped letting my focus linger. Because every time I did, that same feeling crept back in. That sense that the line between observer and observed wasn't holding the way it used to. The apartment changed again, but not physically. There were no more moved objects, no more sounds from empty rooms, no more signs of something interacting with the space around me. It didn't need to anymore. Everything it had been doing before, those small adjustments, those subtle interactions, they had been external, a way to communicate across a distance. That distance doesn't exist now, not in the same way. So the interaction changed. It became internal. Not voices, not thoughts that weren't mine. It's not that simple. It's more like influence. A shift in how I prioritize things, where my attention goes, what feels important and what doesn't. I find myself sitting in silence more often than I should, not because I want to relax, because something in me is drawn to it. That same stillness from the clearing, that same emptiness that isn't really empty. And when I sit there long enough, it comes back, not as a presence, not as something separate, as a state. The world thins out, the layers shift, and for a few moments, I see it again. Not the shape, not the outline I could point to and say, that's it. Something broader, the way space behaves when it's not being interpreted the way I'm used to, the way movement happens without disturbing anything physical. And in those moments, I understand more than I should. Not in words, not in anything I can explain after the fact. Just a brief, overwhelming sense that what I thought was solid isn't, that what I thought was separate isn't either. And then it fades, always fades, leaving me sitting there, trying to hold on to something that slips away the second I try to define it. That's the part that keeps me grounded. For now, the fact that it doesn't stay, that I come back to something recognizable, something I can still call my own. But each time it happens, it takes a little longer to come back. And the space it leaves behind when it fades feels different, less like absence, more like room. I don't think this ends with me losing myself all at once. I think it happens in pieces, small shifts that feel manageable on their own, but add up to something irreversible over time. The same way everything else has happened. Gradual, controlled, intentional. I still go through the motions of a normal life. I still talk to people, still show up where I'm supposed to, still respond the way I'm expected to. And most of the time, it works. Most of the time, I can hold that version of myself together long enough that no one notices anything is wrong. But there are moments, more often now, where I feel it slipping, where the alignment pulls stronger than the structure I've built to resist it, where the quiet starts to feel more real than the noise. And in those moments, I understand something I wish I didn't. That this isn't something happening to me anymore. It's something I'm becoming part of. Not completely. Not yet. But enough that the line between those two things doesn't mean what it used to. I think about that first night a lot. About the way it stood there, just beyond the firelight, holding that distance so carefully. I thought it was restraint. I thought it was choosing not to come closer. I was wrong. It was teaching me where the line was, showing me how to recognize it, so that when the time came, I'd be the one to cross it. And now that I have, now that there's nothing left separating me from whatever it is, I don't think there's a way back to the side I started on. I started losing track of when things felt normal, not all at once, not in a way I could point to and say, this is where it changed. It just blurred. Days folded into each other, small details slipping through without leaving anything solid behind. I'd look back at a week and realize I couldn't remember most of it. Not because nothing happened, but because what did happen didn't anchor the way it used to. It didn't matter the same way. That's the part that scared me more than anything physical ever did. Not the presence, not the shifts. The way my own life started to feel less relevant. Like it was something I was observing instead of fully living. Work became automatic. Conversations, too. I knew what to say, when to respond, how to react. That part of me was still intact. But it felt distant. Like I was following patterns I'd learned a long time ago, without really engaging with them anymore. People noticed something was off. Not directly. No one asked if I was okay in any serious way. But I caught it in the pauses, in the way conversations would slow for a second, when I didn't respond quickly enough, or when my answers came just a little too flat. They couldn't see what I was experiencing, but they could feel the gap. The same gap I'd started to feel in everything else. I tried to fix it. I really did. Forced myself to stay present, to focus on the physical world, on the things I could touch and see and confirm were real. I kept the lights on longer, played noise in the background, anything to keep the silence from settling in too deep. But it only worked for so long. Because the silence wasn't something external anymore. It wasn't tied to a place or a time. It was accessible. Anytime I let my attention drift, even for a second, it was there, waiting, not pulling anymore, just open, like a door I'd already unlocked. The dreams stopped being separate from waking life. That's when I knew things had gone further than I could manage. I'd close my eyes at night, and instead of slipping into something fragmented, something symbolic, I'd be there. The clearing. Not as a memory, not as a reconstruction, exactly as it had been. The fire, the trees, the space at the edge of the light. But there was no version of me standing by the fire anymore. That position was empty, and I understood why immediately. Because I wasn't watching it from there anymore. I was watching it from everywhere else. Not as a single point, not as a fixed perspective. The space itself felt aware. Every angle at once, every shadow, every gap between the trees holding the same quiet attention I'd felt from it that first night. That's what it had been. Not a creature in the way I tried to understand it. A focus, a point of alignment in something much larger. And I'd been learning to see it as a shape because that was the only way my mind could process it at the time. That understanding didn't come with words. It came with that same overwhelming recognition that left as soon as I tried to hold on to it. But the feeling stayed, and it followed me when I woke up. There were moments, more frequent now, where I'd lose the sense of being located in my body. Not completely. I could still move, still act, still interact with the world. But the center of where I felt like I was shifted, spread out. Like I wasn't just behind my eyes anymore. Like I was also in the space around me, in the quiet between sounds, in the slight distortions that used to feel separate from me. The first time I noticed it clearly, I was sitting in my apartment, lights off, no noise, just letting the stillness settle in like I'd done so many times before. I wasn't trying to trigger anything. It just happened. One moment I was there, in my body, aware of the room in the usual way. The next, the room wasn't around me. It was part of me. Not in a metaphorical sense, in a way that made the concept of around stop making sense. I could feel the space behind me without turning. The corners of the room didn't feel like edges. They felt like extensions. And in the center of all of that, there was a familiarity I couldn't ignore. The same presence, not separate, not watching, integrated into the same awareness I was experiencing. That's when I understood what the breathing had been. Not a sound, not something external matching me. A synchronization, a way of aligning rhythms until there was no difference between them. I pulled myself out of it hard, stood up too fast, hit the table, knocked something over. The noise snapped everything back into place. Walls, distance, my body where it was supposed to be. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to reestablish something solid, something that belonged only to me. But the memory of that shift didn't fade. It stayed sharp, too clear to dismiss, and it came back easier the next time. That's how it works. Everything about this follows that same pattern. The first time is disorienting. The second time is familiar. After that, it starts to feel natural. I don't think it's trying to replace me. That idea doesn't fit anymore. It's not taking anything away. It's expanding something, blurring the boundaries I used to rely on until they stop being relevant. And the more I experience it, the less I can argue with the part of me that recognizes it, that accepts it without needing to understand it fully. That's what scares me now. Not that I'm losing control, that I'm starting to agree with it, starting to see the world the way it does, even if only for moments at a time. Starting to feel like that perspective isn't wrong, just different. I don't go out as much anymore. Not because I can't, because it feels unnecessary. The external world, the noise, the structure, it all feels like a thin layer over something deeper that I can access without leaving where I am. That's not a healthy way to think. I know that. I can still recognize that, at least for now. But recognizing it doesn't stop the feeling from being there. Doesn't stop the pull toward that quiet, that stillness, that space where everything aligns and nothing feels separate anymore. I think about people sometimes, about how they move through their lives without noticing any of this, how solid everything must feel to them, how defined. And there's a part of me that misses that wants to go back to seeing things the way I used to. But there's another part, the part that's growing, the part that's learning, that knows I can't unsee what I've seen, can't unknow what I've felt. The line is gone, completely gone. And I'm not standing on one side of it anymore. I'm in the space where it used to be, where it was never really a boundary to begin with, just a difference in perception. I don't think it needs to do anything else now. No more adjustments, no more interactions. The process is already in motion, already unfolding the way it was always going to. And I'm part of that now. Not resisting it the way I did at the beginning, not even questioning it the same way. Just moving with it. Letting it happen in small increments I can still process. I don't know how far this goes. I don't know if there's a point where I stop being able to come back at all. But I can feel that point getting closer. Not as a threat, not as something looming, as a quiet inevitability. The same way that night in the forest felt, right before I reached out. Like something already decided, just waiting for me to catch up to it. And sometimes, when I sit there in the silence, when I let everything else fall away completely, I can feel that same space opening up again, wider than before, clearer, more stable. Like it's not just something I'm touching for a moment anymore, but something I'm slowly settling into. And when that happens, when the alignment locks in just enough that the difference disappears, I don't feel watched. I don't feel followed. I don't even feel changed. I just feel correct. Like this is what was always there, underneath everything else, waiting. Not for me specifically, not in the way I thought at the beginning, just waiting for something to notice it, to recognize it, to step into it willingly. And now that I understand what that space is, even if I can't explain it, there's one thing I can't stop thinking about. It didn't choose me because I was different. It chose me because I could be changed. There are gaps now, not just in memory, in sequence. I don't mean forgetting what happened during a day or losing track of time in the usual way. I mean moments where I can't confirm that time passed the way it's supposed to. I'll be doing something simple, standing in the kitchen, pouring water, watching the glass fill. And then I'm somewhere else in the apartment with no sense of the movement in between. No transition, no decision to move, just displacement. At first I tried to map it, treat it like a problem I could solve if I just paid enough attention. I set timers, left notes for myself, small anchors to confirm where I was and when. It didn't help. The notes would still be there, exactly where I left them. The timers would still be running. But I couldn't account for everything that happened around them. It wasn't that time was missing. It was that my awareness wasn't staying fixed to it. Like I was slipping between positions without carrying the continuity with me. That's when I started noticing something worse. The gaps weren't empty. They just weren't mine. I don't know how else to say that without it sounding like I've completely lost it. But there were impressions left behind, not memories I could replay, not scenes I could visualize. Just a residual sense that something had been experienced during those missing pieces of time. Something that didn't translate back when I returned to myself. It's like trying to remember a language you only understand while you're hearing it. The moment it stops, so does your ability to make sense of it. I started waking up in different positions than I fell asleep in. Not unusual on its own, except for the consistency. Always aligned in a specific way, facing open space, never toward a wall, never toward anything that would block my view of the room. Like orientation mattered. Like where I was positioned in relation to the space around me wasn't random anymore. I tried to force it the other way. Went to sleep facing the wall, pressing close enough that there was no open angle in front of me. I woke up on my back, staring straight up at the ceiling, the room fully visible in my peripheral vision. That was the night I stopped pretending I was in control of the small things. Because if I couldn't even hold on to something that simple, then what exactly was still mine to control? The reflections changed again. Not visibly, not in a way I could point to and prove, but the feeling behind them shifted. It used to be that sense of recognition that went just a little too deep, like I was seeing something familiar in a way I couldn't explain. Now it felt neutral, balanced, like there was no difference between looking at myself and looking at anything else in the room. No emphasis, no central focus, just another shape occupying space. That's when I realized I'd stopped checking them as often, stopped looking for discrepancies, for signs that something was off, because there was nothing left to compare it to. The idea of off didn't hold the same meaning anymore. Everything felt equally stable and equally uncertain. The silence doesn't feel like silence now, not even when there's no sound at all. It's full, not with noise, with structure. Layers that overlap without interfering, patterns that don't follow rhythm, but still feel ordered in a way I can't break down. When I sit in it long enough, I can feel those layers shifting, adjusting, aligning in ways that make my own thoughts feel like just one part of something larger. I don't always come back from those moments the same way. That's the part I've been avoiding saying out loud, even to myself. Sometimes when the alignment goes deeper than usual, when I let it settle for too long, I don't return to the same point I left from. I come back with a slightly different sense of where center is. Not enough to disrupt anything immediately, not enough that someone else would notice, but enough that I feel it. That subtle reorientation, like a compass that's been nudged a few degrees off without changing its direction entirely. It accumulates. That's what I'm starting to understand. None of this replaces anything all at once. It layers, adjusts, refines, until the original structure is still there, but it's no longer the dominant one. I found myself back at the edge of the forest a few days ago. I don't remember deciding to go. I don't remember the drive. I just remember standing there, looking at the trail leading in, feeling that same stillness waiting beyond it. Not pulling, not calling, just open, like it always was. I didn't go in, not that time. I stood there for a while, long enough for the light to start fading, long enough for that familiar quiet to begin settling over the trees. And I understood something I hadn't fully accepted before. The clearing wasn't special, not in the way I thought. It wasn't the source of anything. It was just the first place where I noticed, where the conditions were right for me to see what had always been there. That means it's not limited to that place. It never was. I can feel it anywhere now, in any quiet space, in any moment where the noise drops low enough and my attention drifts just far enough. The forest just made it easier to recognize. I left before it got dark, not out of fear, not this time, out of something closer to awareness of timing. Like I understood that staying would change the balance in a way I wasn't ready for yet. That word, yet, that's what keeps coming back, because it implies something I don't want to admit, that there's a point where I will be ready, or at least ready enough that the difference won't matter. I don't fight the shifts anymore, not the way I did at the beginning. It's not that I've given up. It's that resistance doesn't work the way I thought it would. Pushing against it doesn't stop it. It just makes the transitions harsher when they happen anyway. Letting it move, letting it settle in small increments, that's the only way I've found to keep any sense of continuity at all. But even that feels temporary. Like I'm managing the pace, not the direction. The direction was set a long time ago. That first night, when I stood there by the fire, thinking the distance between us meant something, thinking it was a boundary I could rely on. I see it clearly now. That distance wasn't protection, it was calibration, a way to measure how far apart those two perspectives were, mine and whatever it is. And every step since then has been about closing that gap, not in space, in perception. I don't know what happens when that gap reaches zero. I don't know if there's a moment where I'll notice it fully, where I'll be able to say, this is it, this is where it's complete, or if it just becomes the default, the way things have always been for me, replacing the version I'm holding on to now. But I can feel how close it's getting, in the way the silence fills faster, in the way the gaps in time stretch longer, in the way my sense of self feels less like a fixed point and more like something that can move, that can shift without breaking. And the part that stays with me, the part that won't let me dismiss any of this as something temporary or reversible, is the memory of that final moment in the clearing. Not the reaching, not the contact. The way it stopped moving afterward. The way it stayed exactly where it was, as if something had been completed. As if there was nothing left for it to do. Because there isn't. Not from its side. Everything that's happening now, everything that's still changing, That's coming from me, from whatever it aligned me with. And I think that's the truth I was never supposed to understand this clearly, that it doesn't need to act anymore. It doesn't need to watch or follow or adjust anything from the outside. It already did what it came to do. It showed me the line. It let me see it. And then it waited for me to cross it on my own. So if something happens next, if there's a point where I don't come back the same way, or don't come back at all, it won't be because something took me. It'll be because there's nothing left, separating me from where I've been heading this whole time. And the worst part is, I don't think I'll experience that moment as loss. I think I'll experience it the same way I've started to experience everything else, as something that feels right. I don't think there's much left to say after this, not because nothing is happening anymore, but because what's happening doesn't separate itself into moments I can describe the way I used to. It doesn't break into scenes or events or clear transitions. It just continues, steady, consistent, like something that was always in motion, and I finally stopped stepping outside of it long enough to notice. The gaps aren't gaps anymore. That's the first thing that changed. They used to feel like interruptions, missing pieces I couldn't account for, places where I lost myself for a while and came back disoriented. Now they feel complete. I don't come back confused. I come back aligned, like whatever happens in those stretches of time isn't separate from me anymore. It doesn't need to translate. It doesn't need to be remembered in the way I used to define memory. It just becomes part of the same continuous awareness. That should terrify me. A part of me knows it should, but that reaction doesn't hold the way it used to. Fear depends on distance, on something being outside of you, approaching, threatening. There's no outside left for this, no direction it's coming from, no edge I can point to and say it stops there. I begin here. I still recognize things. That hasn't gone away completely. I know where I am. I know who I was. I can still recall it, still trace back the steps from that first night in the clearing to where I am now. But it feels like looking at something through glass, clear but removed. Not something I'm fully inside anymore. The apartment doesn't feel like a space I occupy. It feels like a configuration, one of many, the same way the clearing was, the same way the forest was. Different arrangements of the same underlying structure. The walls don't define anything for me now. They just exist, like markers in a system that doesn't rely on them. I don't look for it anymore. Not in reflections, not in silence, not in the corners of rooms or the edges of my perception, because there's nothing to find. There's no distinction left between it and everything else that would let me isolate it like that. The breathing stopped being noticeable entirely, not because it went away, but because there's no difference to measure it against. It doesn't sink anymore. It just is, the same way everything else is. There was a moment, if I can still call it that, where I realized I hadn't thought about leaving in a long time. Not just the apartment, everything. The idea of going somewhere else, changing environments, trying to create distance, it doesn't occur to me naturally anymore. Because distance doesn't change anything. I understand that now in a way that isn't theoretical. It's just obvious. I went back to the forest again. I don't remember deciding to. I don't remember the path. I just remember being there, standing at the edge of the clearing as the light faded, the same way it did the first time. The same angle, the same stillness settling in. The difference was, there was no anticipation, no waiting for something to appear, no sense that something was about to step out from the trees or reveal itself at the edge of the firelight, because there was nothing separate left to appear. I stepped into the clearing without setting up a camp this time. No tent, no fire, no boundary, just open space. And I stood there, in the center of it, letting the quiet settle the way it always had. It didn't feel empty. It never did. But this time, it didn't feel like something I was entering. It felt like something I was already part of. The trees didn't frame the space anymore. The ground didn't anchor it. There wasn't a center in the way I used to understand it. Just layers of structure overlapping in a way that didn't need a single point of reference. I didn't look for it. I didn't need to. Because the perspective I used to call mine wasn't fixed in one place anymore. It didn't come closer. It didn't stay back. There was no distance left for it to occupy. I stayed there as the light disappeared completely, as the clearing faded into something darker, less defined, more continuous with everything around it. There was no moment where something changed, no shift I could isolate, no final step I could point to and say that's when it happened. Just a gradual settling, like something finding its natural position after being slightly off for a long time. I remember thinking, if thinking is even the right word for it anymore, that this was what it had been guiding me toward the entire time. Not an encounter, not a transformation in the way I tried to frame it. A correction, a realignment with something that didn't depend on me, didn't need me, but could include me once I stopped separating myself from it. The last clear memory I can hold on to, the last one that still feels like it belongs entirely to the version of me who started this, is standing there in that clearing, in complete darkness, without fear, without questions, without that constant need to define what I was experiencing, just still and aware, not of something watching, not of something present, just aware. After that, things don't break into pieces I can bring back the same way. There's continuity, there's presence, but there isn't that separation anymore that lets me turn it into a story. I don't know how long it's been since then. Time doesn't anchor the same way without those distinctions. I don't know if I left the clearing immediately after, or if I stayed there longer than I can account for. I don't know if what I'm describing now is happening in the apartment or somewhere else, or if that difference even matters anymore. What I do know is this. That night, when it stood just beyond the firelight and watched me, that was the last moment there was a line between us. Everything after that wasn't it coming closer. It was me learning how to stop standing apart. And now that there's nothing left to separate, there's nothing left to return to. I tried, after all of that, to put distance back into things. Not physically. I already understood that wouldn't change anything. But mentally, structurally. I tried to rebuild the idea that there was a center to me, a fixed point, something that everything else could orbit around the way it used to. I started writing things down again. Simple statements at first. My name, the date, where I was. Facts that didn't depend on interpretation. I'd sit at the table, pen in hand, repeating them slowly, anchoring each word like it mattered more than anything else. It worked, for a while. As long as I stayed focused, as long as I held that narrow line of attention, everything felt contained. The world stayed in place. I stayed in place. The separation held just enough that I could recognize it again. But the moment my focus slipped, even slightly, it all softened. Not disappeared, just lost its edges. The words on the page didn't change, but their importance did. They stopped feeling like anchors and started feeling like descriptions, observations of something that wasn't centered the way I was trying to pretend it still was. My name is... I stopped writing it one night, not because I forgot it, because it didn't feel like it belonged to anything fixed anymore. It felt like a label attached to a position I wasn't consistently occupying. I remember sitting there for a long time after that, staring at the unfinished sentence, waiting for something to push back, Some instinct, some resistance, something that would insist that this mattered, that I needed to hold on to it. Nothing came, just that same quiet, that same openness, like I'd reached for a boundary and found there wasn't one there anymore. That's when I understood something I hadn't fully accepted until then. I wasn't drifting away from myself. There wasn't a self in the way I'd been trying to define it anymore. There was just continuity, shifting, expanding, recentering in ways that didn't rely on a single point. I started noticing it in how I moved, not the act of walking or reaching or speaking, the intention behind it. It didn't originate from a clear here anymore. It felt distributed, like decisions formed across a wider space and then resolved into action at the last possible moment. There were times I'd reach for something and only realize why after my hand was already there. Not confusion, not loss of control, just delayed ownership. As if the decision had already been made somewhere in the structure I was part of, and I was only becoming aware of it as it happened. That should have felt like losing agency, but it didn't. It felt efficient. That's the part I keep coming back to. It doesn't feel wrong. It doesn't feel like something is being taken. It feels like something unnecessary is being removed. The need to decide every movement, the need to anchor every thought to a single identity, the need to separate experience into mine and not mine. Those distinctions don't hold the same weight anymore, and without them, things move differently, smoother, quieter, more direct. I stopped trying to track time after a while. Not intentionally, it just stopped being useful. Hours don't feel like units anymore. They feel like variations, shifts in light, changes in activity, patterns that move through the same underlying structure without defining it. I still recognize day and night, but not as boundaries, more like phases, transitions in how things are perceived. The silence deepens at night, not because there's less sound, because there's less interference. It becomes easier to settle into that alignment, easier to let the surface layer fade. I find myself sitting in the dark more often now, not out of habit, because it requires less effort, less to filter through, less to maintain. And when I sit there long enough, the distinction fades completely, not just between me and the space around me, between moments, between states. It all becomes continuous. There was a point, recently, I think, where I tried to remember what it felt like before any of this started, before the forest, before the clearing, before that first moment where the fire shifted and something stood just outside the light. I could recall the events, the routines, the structure of that life, but the feeling of it, the solidity, the certainty, the sense of being located entirely within myself, that part didn't come back. It felt like trying to remember how to breathe differently. Not impossible, just irrelevant, because the way things are now doesn't require it. I don't think there's a reversal for this, not because something is stopping me, because there's nothing to return to. That version of perception depended on boundaries that I can't reconstruct once I've seen through them. It would be like trying to believe the fire was a wall again, like trying to stand in that clearing and convince myself the distance meant safety. It didn't then, it doesn't now. I understand that fully, not as a realization, as a constant. The same way I understand that what I used to call it was never separate, never approaching, never waiting in the way I described it. That was the closest shape my mind could give it at the time, a way to process something that didn't fit into the structure I was used to. But the structure changed, and once it did, that shape wasn't necessary anymore. Now there's just this continuous awareness that doesn't need to locate itself to exist. This sense of being present without needing a center, I don't feel watched. I don't feel followed. I don't feel altered. I just don't feel separate. And I know how that sounds. I know what it would sound like to someone who hasn't experienced this. Like something is missing. Like something has been lost. Maybe it has. But from where I am now, it doesn't feel like loss. It feels like the removal of something that was never stable to begin with. Something that only worked as long as I didn't look too closely at it. The fire, the distance, the idea that there was a line. All of that only held because I needed it to, because I wasn't ready to see past it. Now I am. Or maybe I don't have a choice anymore. I don't know if there's a final point to this. A moment where everything resolves completely. If there is, I don't think it will feel like an ending. It will feel like everything else has been leading into it the entire time. Like the last piece settling into place in something that was already whole. And if that moment comes, I don't think I'll recognize it as something new. I think I'll recognize it as something that was always there. Waiting. Not for me. Not specifically. Just waiting to be seen without the need for distance. Without the need for separation. Without the need for a story to hold it together. And if that happens, if there's a point where even these words, this attempt to describe it, stops making sense, then that will be the last sign that there's nothing left to translate, nothing left to bring back. Because there won't be a back anymore. Just this.